Steve, how you doing, man? How was your weekend?
Good morning, David. Thank you for asking. I had a fabulous weekend. How was yours?
It was pretty good, except that I'm still annoyed with the weather. I can't wait for summer to come along.
I got to
I
tell
mean,
you, I'm a much better person with a tan, so I'm with you on that. For once, we agree on something here. So
yeah, that's not often. So, who do we have today for a guest?
hold on, let me check. I might have forgotten his name. No, of course. How could I forget? So today we actually have a fellow Steven, right? So today we have Mr. Stephen Lang. He's from Falcon Engineering. He's principal over at the Falcon Group. The Falcon Group is a national company, but he heads up the building envelope division for New Jersey. Steve, thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for sharing with our viewers. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is that you actually do over there at Falcon Group?
Sounds good. Thanks, guys. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure. I'm an architect, so I specialize in working with buildings. That's with the building structures, with the building envelope. My team in New Jersey, we work with buildings anywhere from townhomes all the way up to high rises. So any needs that a building has, they'll typically come to our group in Falcon, and we'll assist them, whether they be having leaks or whether they need to do a siding replacement, roof replacement, things like that. Basically help troubleshoot all kinds of problems for communities throughout the state of New Jersey. And then, as you mentioned, we also have offices in New York, Connecticut, all up and down the East Coast.
And Florida, present in Florida as well. Do a lot of
Correct.
work on there. Now, quick question. You did mention building envelope, building structure. What's the difference in 30 seconds or less?
The building envelope is essentially the outer shell of the building. It includes the roof, it includes the exterior walls, windows, any systems that are essentially helping to prevent weather from penetrating into the building. It protects the interior occupants from rain, wind, cold, things like that. There's a little bit of a difference between that and the building structure. The building structure is actually what helps hold the building up. In some cases, the building envelope may also be part of the building structure. You may have load-bearing exterior walls, things like that. In other cases, you may have a curtain wall system, and then the building envelope is essentially transferring loads like wind loads to the building structure. There's some slight differences, but they also tie together and they have to kind of work together to help support different loads on the building.
Yeah, you used some pretty technical terms back there for a second. Can you dumb it down? I mean, architecture is technical, but so how are the two systems, envelope and structure, how can they be interrelated?
So, just so you know, I understood everything, but if you can dumb it down for Steve, that would be great.
Please.
No, if you think about it, like anything from a basic tent structure where you have the outer fabric, when the wind blows, that outer fabric is essentially the building envelope, if you will. That's keeping the wind out, it's keeping the rain out, it's keeping the elements from getting inside the tent, if you will. The poles that are on the inside are typically what's holding that tent up. That's the structure. You'll have those two systems. If you didn't have the poles inside, well, the building wouldn't stand up. That's your structure. And if you didn't have the outer skin, well, you'd have just rain and water and everything coming through to the inside. So to work with a building, you have to have both of those elements to create shelter for the occupants inside.
Thank you for explaining.
Again, you learned something today, huh?
Sure did.
All right. So on a big building, so let's say a high-rise community, what should the owners or the communities that live in there be aware of in respect to the actual building envelope?
It's a great question. When we work with high-rise communities, one of the things that we see is that the building occupants are going in and out of the building, they're walking at street level, and they don't really have a view of the upper floors of the building. Typically in our day-to-day life, we're focused on looking at our phones, looking at people on the street, looking at signage that may be only a story or so high. So our eyes aren't always focused on the upper portions of the building. It's for these reasons that a lot of times the upper portions of the building can become in pretty bad shape. You'll have areas where sealant joints start to fail or sections of the building start to become loose and in some cases fall to the ground. And we don't always know it as folks that are just traveling along the sidewalks every day and not really looking up. In addition to that, when you have high-rise buildings, anything that's over 4 to 6 stories, a lot of times depending upon how far you can get away from the building, you can't really see. You don't get a really good view of those areas. So it can be very difficult for building owners to really understand what condition their building's actually in, because again, they're not looking closely at it and they kind of take it for granted. They just assume that everything's fine up there because they're not looking at it.
Yeah, you took the words out of my mouth. It's something that you kind of do take for granted, that the building is not going to go anywhere. So at what point, at what age do the building management or the unit owners, when do they, or the boards, when do they become concerned?
It can vary. There's a number of things that can factor into that question. But essentially, when it comes to the building envelope, typically anytime a building is 10 years, that's when you may start to have conditions that are starting to could potentially be an issue. And so a lot of times, your general rule of thumb when it comes to the building envelope is that buildings that are over that 5 to 10 year range should really start considering having inspections performed. There's different standards and city ordinances out there that have certain requirements for it. And usually they get triggered by about that 5 to 10 year mark, depending
Okay.
upon location.
Same
But
question on structures and stuff. So same kind of age range for the structure, or is that different?
for structure, it's a little bit different. When you're talking about the building envelope, you're talking about areas that are more often exposed to the elements, to the weather, and
Okay.
they can get in bad shape a lot quicker than structural components. So typically, when you're looking at the structure, you're not really having to do that inspection until 10 years out. When a
Okay.
building's about 20 years old, you may have to do another inspection, and then you may do more frequent inspections thereafter. But with a facade, you're looking at after 5 years doing an inspection every 5 years. So those cycles, generally, as a rule of thumb, are going to
Got
be
it.
more frequent than they would be for a structural inspection.
Fabulous. Thank you.
All right. So as far as that's concerned, inspection and everything, are they like the requirements? Are they driven by the city, the state, the county? Is it a federal requirement? Where does that come from?
Right now, they're pretty much city requirements. There's a number of cities that have put ordinances out that require routine facade inspections. There's really not as much on the structural side at this point. And when you look at how big our country is and how many cities that we have, it's kind of very interesting and somewhat concerning that only 13 cities actually have requirements for routine facade inspections. And a lot of times, the active as a nation, as a society, we typically wait until something bad happens and then we put in new requirements. That's essentially how the building codes originally came around, essentially put in place after fires in Chicago. That really did a big push. And then every time that there's unfortunately, a tragedy, it seems like there's new requirements that get put in place. We're seeing from Surfside a big push for more routine facade inspections and structural inspections, just because, again, for a lot of those reasons, people take for granted the condition of their building. At this point, there's only 13 cities that do have those requirements in place.
But no, it's not 13 states, it's 13 cities.
Cities, correct.
Wow, that's kind of scary, actually.
It's pretty shocking when you think about it.
And what kind of regulations? So if you're doing a structural inspection, what kind of regulatory things are they looking for? I mean, other than, you see rebar sticking out. Give some examples if you could.
So when it comes to the facades, you're really looking at, and it's going to vary depending upon the city. They all have their own different requirements. So you really want to check with local professionals on that. When it comes to facades, for example, in New York, they want you to do hands-on inspections where you get up close and actually do drops at every certain distance. In other places, you can do more visual inspections, use drones and things like that. It's less restrictive. When it comes to the structural side of things, there's really not as many requirements. There's not the same number of ordinances in place right now. Florida has some requirements. They have kind of a recertification process that they put in place. There's much fewer areas that have already implemented these requirements. Something that's really interesting that's coming up now is that you're seeing CAI take a look at this and saying, well, we need to do something about this. We need to come up with better guidelines for communities to assist them. And they're really pushing to try to put together a package that could be presented and maybe accepted on a state level or a federal level. At this point in time, nothing officially has been adopted, but right now it's coming down to the individual cities and states to put in these different requirements.
Man, I imagine that would slow things down. That every city you go into, you have to actually consult the city engineers and try to find out what the regulations are before you can put together a plan to try to go in and do an inspection. No?
It presents a lot of challenges. I, for one, am looking forward to what CAI is putting together. I think we better have a more formal, recognized standard, more standardized requirements instead of having each individual city be tasked with trying to put this together on their own, because there are differences and nuances to each of them that make it very challenging for your professionals to go out and do these evaluations. So again, it would be much easier if it was standardized across between what New York requires, what Jersey City requires, what Philadelphia requires. They're all kind of right now having to do their own thing, and it just makes it very difficult to standardize that process across different offices.
Wow, yeah, and I imagine it's something that needs to be done relatively quickly. It's not like we can develop this program over years and years and years. I mean, CAI has been instrumental in pushing things along. We have some help with legislation and whatnot. So you guys are on the pointy end of getting the program put together, I'm guessing?
That's it. Yeah. I've had a lot of discussions with different members of the LAC committee. I know that they're working hard on it. And it's not only just CAI from New Jersey, it's also on a national level.
Okay.
They've put together a lot of studies. And you're right, it is something that we need to get sooner than later. But it's something that's been in the works for a number of years. And I think it's still going to take a little bit more time before we get any traction with anything that's standardized. So in the short term, something that building owners need to think about is without these requirements in place, it's really put on them to make sure that their buildings are safe.
Okay.
In the state of New Jersey, we have the Hotel and Multiple Dwellings Code that you have to essentially follow. It just puts the onus on the owner to make sure that their buildings are safe. And so when you think about that, if you have an older building, let's say that's anywhere from over 10 to 20 years old, they're essentially saying that you're responsible for doing these inspections on your own. The
Got it.
liability that goes along with that goes back to the individual building owners. So essentially, you should be thinking about implementing these things independently, even if it's not something that's required by city ordinance. Again, this is mostly for buildings that are 4 stories with masonry facades or 6 stories with other facades. So like curtain walls, those types of buildings. So high-rise buildings, really.
All right. So if I'm a property manager, I'm cited or a portfolio, do you have any advice? What should I be concerned about? And how would I go about getting an inspection? How would I make that decision?
That's a good question. Most of these owners are typically working with an engineering professional already. You're engaging them to work on capital reserve studies, things like that. I think a good time to have these discussions are when you go through and you do a reserve update. You should be talking about this because a lot of the reserve updates, they're not going to include those detailed inspections. They're not getting up on swing stages or scaffoldings or flying a drone and looking at conditions of the building. They're just basically going off of useful life tables. So there could be areas of the building that are unsafe. So I would definitely have a conversation with your engineering professional. Use that time when the reserve study comes up to say, hey, we want to talk a little bit more about our building facade or the structure of the building. When would be a good time for us to go through and do a more detailed review of these things just to ensure that our building is safe? And then see what they have to say based upon your individual building and their understanding of how old it is, what condition it is, what the building type is, and so on.
I have a question actually regarding the importance of staying proactive for managers, because on our end we see sometimes building envelope issues that are neglected for a certain amount of time will definitely impact the insurance market availability for the associations. What's your take on that? When we tell from our standpoint, from the insurance standpoint, say, hey, you need to address this. This is important. How often do you get the pushback from the managers, and what would be your reasoning when it comes to addressing some of these issues?
So I think the pushback usually comes from financial reasons. I think that a lot of times, anytime that the board is surprised by a cost that comes up, routine maintenance or a project that they weren't expecting, that's oftentimes when you'll get a lot of pushback from them. Anytime that there's costs come into play, it creates a number of variables and it makes it difficult for engineers to do their job. We often struggle to get boards to update their reserve studies regularly. They want to push it out. They want to update them every, 5 years, 10 years. They don't want to do the 3 to 5 year cycle. I think it's just kind of changing the culture and educating managers of the importance of updating the reserve studies so that they're really done every 3 years. With what we've gone through with COVID recently, we've seen some huge price fluctuations in the market and the cost of construction materials. And it's created a lot of hardships on communities because that project that they were planning to do is now 35% to 40% more expensive than it was a few years ago. And now they're surprised with that cost. They don't have the money for it. So they're looking at ways that they're either going to come up with that money, they're going to go out to a special assessment, or they're going to have to go and get a loan. I think the sooner that we get these boards to update their reserves, to be proactive with looking at their buildings, having a professional come through and do a more detailed review, because the reserve is really cursory. It's somebody that goes out really quickly from ground level or from a few balconies and is just kind of eyeballing things. The more that you put into your plan, the easier it's going to be so that you don't have those surprises. And then you're not going to have the insurance issues that you guys are citing. Because if you got unsafe conditions and you weren't updating your reserve and you weren't planning on it, well, now your back's up against the wall because you got to move ASAP to make that building safe. And that it's not a good situation for anybody. The last thing I need is to get a call, hey, we need to get somebody out tomorrow to come out and look at this building because we've got other projects and things that we're trying to line up and do. So I think the reality of it is that just taking a step back, taking better care of our buildings, being more proactive with the planning and the reserve funding is going to go a long way to eliminate assessments and surprises.
Yeah.
And when that next cycle comes up that you've got to update your reserve study, push the boards to get it updated. It's a small cost in the grand scheme of things, but it can save you a ton of headaches down the road.
Now, do you guys, when you update a reserve study, do you guys ever go out and speak with the boards directly as to priorities? Like this has to be done, within 6 months. This has to be done within a year. This has to be done every 3 years. Do you guys ever get that down and dirty with the boards as to what really needs to be done?
A lot of the reserve studies, they're going to get it down. It's not usually within the 6-month period. It's usually within a year. So it'll say that this item has 0 remaining years of useful life, and you're going to have to address it now. This one's got a year. This one's got 2. So it is kind of laying it out. So there's a plan of attack for how to properly maintain your buildings and to replace certain items. So to me, it's the biggest key to a successful and healthy financially community is to make sure that that reserve is updated. In addition to that, too, don't just get the paper updates. Get somebody that's going to go out to the site, take a look at the building. They might flag certain issues, and they may recommend further evaluation of different things that might be concerning that they see. Take that advice, have those things looked at, because it could lead to a safety issue, or it could lead to a huge financial issue down the road.
Yeah, that's so true. So true. Now we're at this time of the show that we're just about to wrap it up, but would like to give you like 30 seconds to plug for whoever, whatever you want, possibly something or someone that is impactful to you, someone that's important to you. I would just want to give you that little soapbox for a second. So go ahead.
Sure. I'd like to give a shout out to Andy Amorosi. Many years ago, Andy brought me into Falcon. He trusted in me. He believed in me. He's a great mentor. He's somebody that brings a lot of positivity. In the world that we live in, it's difficult to find folks that will lift you up and will help build you up and give you encouragement. A lot of times within the work that we do, and I'm sure that you guys see this too, you only hear from people when something bad happens, when something negative happens. It's nice to have people that are going to be out there and spread positivity, that give encouragement, that do push you to be the best that you can be. So I just like to say thank you to Andy for everything that he's done. I wouldn't be here today meeting with you guys and having a great time doing this car chat if it weren't for him. So just want to say thanks to him.
Well, thank you, Steve, for being on the show today. We learned a lot. Speaking to the managers about getting the reserve studies done, speaking to the boards, the building owners is very important stuff. We got to take care of the building. You can't take it for granted. So thanks for bringing all this stuff to light, the difference between the structures and the envelopes, explaining that to David in nice, clean, plain English so that he can understand nice and slowly. But thanks a lot for being here, Steve. And thank you guys for watching. And we'll see you guys next week on the next installment of Community Association Car Chat. See you guys.
See you guys next time.
Thank you.